At 2:17 p.m. on August 14, 1944, aviation machinist's mate, Second Class Tommy Rodriguez, crouched behind the wing of his F4U Corsair at Henderson Field, Guadal Canal, watching his pilot climb into the cockpit for what might be the last time. 19 years old, 8 months maintaining Corsairs, zero understanding of why his pilots kept dying. The Japanese had sent 24 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters to intercept the afternoon patrol. American pilots had engaged them in 17 separate dogfights that week. 11 Corsairs had gone down. The pattern was always the same. American pilot spots Japanese fighter. American pilot opens fire at standard range. Guns jam after 200 rounds. Japanese pilot circles back and puts bullets through the stalled Corsair while the pilot fights desperately to clear his weapons. Rodriguez had seen the combat reports. He'd read the maintenance logs. He'd interviewed pilots who'd survived the gun failures. The ammunition belts were overheating during sustained fire. Simple physics, deadly consequences. When a Corsair pilot held the trigger down for more than 4 seconds, the 650 caliber machine guns generated enough heat to warp the ammunition feed mechanisms. The rounds started binding in the chambers. The guns stopped firing one by one. 4 seconds was enough time for a Zero to close 400 yards and return fire. The Japanese didn't have this problem. Their 20mm cannons could fire longer bursts without overheating. Zero pilots knew about the American gun problems. They baited Corsair pilots into extended firing sequences, stayed just out of effective range until the American guns jammed. Then they moved in for the kill. Rodriguez had spent 6 months working on the problem. The engineering teams at Chance Vought were designing a new ammunition feed system, a proper solution, a complete redesign of the gun cooling mechanism. But the new system wouldn't be ready until 1945, maybe 1946. The war wouldn't wait. The pilots couldn't wait. Every afternoon, young men climbed into Corsairs knowing their own guns might fail them before the Japanese got the chance to shoot back. Lieutenant Michael Hayes walked past Rodriguez toward his aircraft, 22 years old, 39 combat missions, 4 confirmed kills. He'd reported gun failures 3 times in the past month, all during extended firing sequences, all times he'd survived by pure luck and 2,800 hours of flight training. He nodded at Rodriguez. Rodriguez nodded back. Hayes didn't know Rodriguez was the ordnance specialist from Cherry Point. He probably thought Rodriguez was just another mechanic. Rodriguez had brought something with him to Henderson Field that morning, a small metal component, precisely machined, dangerous beyond belief. His team at Marine Aircraft Group 14 had tested it on a captured Zero for 3 weeks. It worked. But testing wasn't combat. Combat was 350 miles per hour. Combat was negative G-forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness. Combat was life or death in 4 seconds. If you want to see how Rodriguez's forbidden modification saved Marine pilots, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten innovations from the Pacific War. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this story gets incredible. Back to Rodriguez. The gun problem had started in May 1944. Marine Fighter Squadron 214 had switched to armor-piercing ammunition. Heavier rounds meant more penetration. More penetration meant Corsair pilots could finally punch through Zero armor at combat range. The F4U could hit 400 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to catch any Japanese fighter. But the Browning M2 machine guns couldn't handle the sustained fire that came with high-speed combat maneuvering. Rodriguez understood aircraft weapons better than anyone at Cherry Point. He joined Marine Aircraft Group 14 in December 1943, 1 month after the Bougainville campaign began. He was one of 3 ordnance specialists in the Pacific Theatre. The other 2 were stationed in Australia. Rodriguez was the only weapons expert actually working with combat squadrons. Most of the mechanics he worked with had never seen a gun failure analysis. Some of them didn't believe sustained fire was the real problem. Rodriguez didn't care what they believed. He cared about keeping pilots alive. He'd grown up hunting in East Texas. At 16, he'd bought his first rifle, a Winchester Model 70. He'd stripped the bolt action down to individual components, learned how every part worked, then rebuilt it. At 19, he'd won the Texas State Marksmanship Championship, 198 out of 200 possible points, accurate enough to earn a Marine Corps recruiting officer's attention. Only 5 civilians in Texas history had shot that score. Rodriguez was the youngest. Competitive shooting had taught him how weapons failed under stress. Rapid fire, extreme temperatures, sustained use. He'd learned to feel what a gun needed before the malfunction happened. That intuition had made him the best ordnance specialist in the Pacific. And now Marine pilots were dying because their guns couldn't handle extended combat sequences. The solution had come to him in July. Simple metallurgy. The ammunition feed mechanisms overheated because heat couldn't dissipate fast enough during rapid fire. What if you modified the heat transfer? Not completely, just enough to prevent binding. The guns would still generate heat, just not enough heat to warp the feed mechanisms. A titanium sleeve with precisely calculated cooling vents. Install it around each gun barrel before the ammunition enters the chamber. Redirect airflow to cool the mechanism during sustained fire. He'd machined the first sleeve himself. Titanium cylinder, 3 inches long, 1.2 inches in diameter. The cooling vents were 0.08 inches wide. Those dimensions mattered. Too large, and the sleeve would reduce muzzle velocity. Too small, and the cooling effect would be negligible. He'd tested 23 different configurations before finding the right one. Then he'd simplified the design. A split cylinder was easier to install, easier to remove if damaged, easier to replace during field maintenance. Ground tests showed it worked. The sleeve prevented overheating during simulated sustained fire sequences. But ground tests weren't combat. He needed to test it on an actual aircraft under actual combat conditions. The problem was getting permission. Installing unauthorized modifications on Marine fighters violated about 60 different regulations. If the sleeve failed in combat and a pilot died, Rodriguez would face court-martial, maybe imprisonment. He decided to skip permission and deal with consequences later. That morning at Henderson Field, he had 12 sleeves in his tool bag and one very cooperative crew chief who owed him a favour. Gunnery Sergeant William Cooper had worked on Corsair armament for 14 months. He'd seen 31 pilots die from gun failures. He didn't ask questions when Rodriguez showed him the titanium cylinder. He just nodded and reached for his wrench set. The Corsair sat on the flight line, pilot inside, engine warming up. 15 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked fast. He removed the cowling from each gun position. The sleeves slid into place around the barrels. He secured them with titanium clamps. 12 minutes of work per gun. The modification was invisible once the cowling was replaced. Lieutenant Hayes would fly with the sleeves. He didn't know they were there. Rodriguez hadn't told him, hadn't told the squadron commander, hadn't told anyone, except Cooper. If the sleeves failed and Hayes died, there would be no paper trail, no authorization forms, no testing documentation. Just a dead pilot and 6 titanium cylinders that shouldn't have been there. The Corsair's Pratt and Whitney engine roared to full power. Hayes ran through pre-flight checks. Oil pressure good. Coolant temperature good. Magnetos firing on all 18 cylinders. He released the brakes. The Corsair rolled forward, gathered speed, lifted off. Rodriguez watched it climb. 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, 2,500 feet. The Corsair banked southeast toward the Russell Islands. He'd brought field glasses. He watched Hayes climb to 18,000 feet. 3 more Corsairs joined him, a division of 4, standard patrol formation. They flew toward Rabaul. Japanese fighters had been active over Rabaul all week. If Hayes encountered Zeros, he'd have to engage, and the sleeves would either work or they wouldn't. Rodriguez waited on the flight line. Cooper stood next to him. Neither of them spoke. Ground crew prepared 4 more Corsairs for the evening patrol. A fuel truck rumbled past. Mechanics shouted technical instructions across the dispersal area, normal sounds of a fighter base at war. Rodriguez heard none of it. He was calculating heat dissipation rates in his head. 0.08-inch vents, maximum cooling at sustained fire rates, 4-second burst duration. The math worked, but math wasn't combat. 50 minutes passed. An hour. Radio silence from Hayes' division. That could mean anything. No contact with enemy fighters, or contact so intense there was no time to report, or Hayes was dead, and his Corsair was scattered across a coral reef somewhere near Bougainville. At 3:24, the radio crackled. Control tower's voice. 4 Corsairs inbound, 3 minutes out. Rodriguez raised the field glasses. He saw them. 4 dark shapes against the afternoon sky. All 4 aircraft. No losses. The Corsairs entered the traffic pattern. Hayes landed first. He taxied to the flight line, cut the engine, climbed out. Rodriguez walked toward him. His hands were shaking. He'd designed ordnance modifications before. He'd tested weapon systems under laboratory conditions. He'd never done anything like this. Never installed an unauthorized modification and sent a pilot into combat to test it. Hayes pulled off his helmet. He was grinning. That was unusual. Pilots didn't grin after combat patrols. They usually looked exhausted, haunted. Hayes looked excited. Cooper asked the question, "Any problems with the guns, sir?" Hayes looked at Cooper, then at Rodriguez, then back at Cooper. "Best the 50s have ever run," he said. Engaged 6 zeros over Rabaul. Fired 1,400 rounds in sustained bursts. Never missed a beat. Rodriguez asked Hayes to describe exactly what happened. He'd spotted 6 A6M0s at 16,000 feet. All aircraft flying northeast toward Rabaul. Hayes had positioned his division above them. Altitude advantage. He'd pushed into a high-speed dive, 420 miles per hour. The dive that should have overheated his guns and killed him. But the Browning M2s kept firing. Full rate of fire through the entire engagement. Hayes had closed to 300 yards before the Japanese pilots saw him. He'd fired a 6-second burst, saw strikes on the lead Zero's left wing route. The Japanese fighter broke hard right and dove toward the deck. Hayes had pulled up, climbed back to altitude. The guns had performed flawlessly. It was the first time in 8 months that Hayes had successfully pressed a sustained attack without his weapons failing. He wanted to know what ordnance had done to his aircraft. Rodriguez told him. He explained the sleeves, the titanium cylinders, the heat dissipation modification. Hayes stared at him for 8 seconds. Then he turned to Cooper. "Put those things in every Corsair on this island," he said. "Today." Rodriguez explained it wasn't authorized. Hayes didn't care about authorization. He cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Henderson Field had lost friends to gun failures. 31 pilots, dead in 6 months. Hayes said if the brass wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war. Right now, his squadron needed working weapons. Cooper installed sleeves in 6 more Corsairs that afternoon. Rodriguez had brought 12 sets. He kept 4 for testing. 8 Corsairs flew combat patrols with sleeves over the next 4 days. 0 gun failures. 23 sustained firing sequences successfully completed against Japanese fighters. Pilots reported the Browning M2s ran perfectly, better than perfectly. Some pilots claimed they were getting higher rates of fire at altitude. Word spread fast. By August 20th, every squadron commander on Guadal Canal knew about the sleeve modification. They wanted it, all of them, immediately. Could Rodriguez come to their flight lines? Could he bring more sleeves? How fast could they be manufactured? The problem was supply. Rodriguez had machined 12 sets of sleeves himself in the Cherry Point workshop. Manufacturing hundreds would require proper production facilities, titanium stock, precision machining equipment, quality control. He needed approval from Marine Corps headquarters. He needed funding. He needed time. He got approval in 6 days. Marine Corps Aviation fast-tracked his proposal. A war-winning modification, they called it. Chance Vought received the production contract. They could manufacture 200 sleeve sets per week. Installation would begin immediately at every marine base in the Pacific. Rodriguez assembled a small team, 4 mechanics from Cherry Point, 2 civilian machinists. They would tour marine airfields and oversee installation. The sleeve could be fitted without removing aircraft from service. That was critical. Every Corsair needed to stay operational. The Japanese were launching daily raids against American positions throughout the Solomon Islands. Marine Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground its squadrons. Rodriguez loaded a Douglas R-4D transport with tools and sleeves. He'd visited 18 marine bases before the war. He knew every fighter strip in the South Pacific. He knew the commanding officers. He knew the ground crews. Now he'd visit them again, this time with titanium cylinders that would save their pilots. By August 25th, installation teams were ready. 800 sleeve sets manufactured, 15 bases on the schedule, 1,200 Corsair engines waiting for modification. Rodriguez climbed aboard the transport and headed north toward Bougainville. Bougainville was the busiest marine base in the Northern Solomons. 48 Corsairs, 16 Dauntless dive bombers, 3 squadrons rotating through continuous combat operations. Rodriguez arrived at 0700 on August 26th. Base Commander Colonel James Anderson met him at the airstrip. He'd lost 12 pilots to gun failures in the past 6 weeks. He wanted the sleeves installed immediately. The ground crews worked in shifts, 6 aircraft at a time. Each installation took 18 minutes per gun. Remove cowling, slide sleeve into position, secure with clamps, replace cowling. The clamping had to be perfect. A loose sleeve at altitude could shift during sustained fire and actually make the overheating problem worse. Rodriguez supervised every installation personally. He checked every clamp, tested every fit, rejected 5 sleeves that didn't meet specifications. Pilots watched the modifications with intense interest. Captain Robert McNeil had 52 combat missions. He'd experienced gun failure 4 times, all during critical moments in dogfights. He asked Rodriguez how a simple sleeve could solve the complex overheating problem. Rodriguez explained heat transfer physics, ammunition feed dynamics, sustained fire effects on metal expansion. McNeil understood immediately. He was a mechanical engineering graduate from Georgia Tech. He called it elegant simplicity. By August 28th, all 48 Corsairs at Bougainville had sleeves installed. Rodriguez moved to Munda, then New Georgia, then Green Island. The pattern repeated at every base. Ground crews worked 14-hour shifts. Pilots flew combat patrols with modified weapons. 0 failures reported. The sleeves worked exactly as designed. Pilots started calling them Rodriguez rings. The nickname came from Captain William Thompson, operations officer at Marine Fighter Squadron 121. It was respectful military humour, acknowledging the mechanic who'd solved their biggest problem. Rodriguez didn't mind. He'd spent 8 months working with Marine personnel. He understood how military men dealt with stress. If nicknames helped them remember the modification, he'd accept any name they chose. The nickname spread faster than the sleeves themselves. By September, every pilot in Marine Corps aviation knew about Rodriguez rings. They requested them specifically. Some pilots refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft had the modification installed. Squadron commanders supported them. They'd seen too many good pilots die from preventable gun failures. Japanese intelligence noticed the change in American fighter performance. Imperial Navy after-action reports from early September mentioned improved marine gunnery accuracy. American fighters no longer broke off attacks during sustained firing sequences. 0 pilots could no longer exploit the overheating weakness. The tactical advantage had disappeared. By mid-September, Rodriguez's team had installed sleeves in 960 Corsair engines, every F4U in Marine Fighter Command, every operational training unit, every aircraft in reserve status. The modification became standard equipment. New aircraft rolling off production lines at Stratford and Dallas came with sleeves pre-installed. The heat dissipation system was still experimental. Chance Vought estimated it would need 6 months of combat testing before full approval, but the sleeves worked so well that some engineers questioned whether further development was necessary. Why redesign the entire cooling system when a $12 titanium sleeve solved the problem? Rodriguez knew the answer. The sleeves were a field modification, a brilliant field modification, but temporary. A proper cooling system would eliminate the overheating problem completely. No airflow restrictions, no velocity limitations, full weapon performance under any flight condition. That was the proper engineering solution. But until 1945, Rodriguez rings kept Marine pilots alive, and that was enough. The results were measurable. Marine Corps aviation tracked combat statistics meticulously. Every engagement, every kill, every loss, the numbers told a clear story. August 1944. Before the sleeves, Marine fighters reported gun failures in 47% of sustained firing sequences against Japanese aircraft. Pilots broke off attacks. Enemy fighters escaped. Or worse, Japanese pilots recognized the weakness and exploited it. They deliberately draw Marine fighters into extended firing sequences, knowing the American guns would fail. September 1944. After the sleeves, gun failures during sustained fire dropped to 0.8%, almost non-existent. The few failures that did occur were unrelated to overheating. Battle damage, ammunition defects, normal combat attrition. The kill-to-loss ratio improved immediately. August had been brutal. Marine Fighter Command lost 43 Corsairs in combat, shot down 61 Japanese aircraft, a ratio of 1.4 to 1, barely acceptable. September was different. 18 Marine fighters lost, 127 Japanese aircraft destroyed, a ratio of 7.1 to 1. The sleeves weren't the only factor, but squadron commanders credited them as a major contributor. Pilots reported increased confidence in combat. Captain David Morrison flew Corsairs out of Peleliu. He'd experienced gun failure 6 times before the sleeves. After installation, he pressed sustained attacks without hesitation. He destroyed 5 Zeros in October, 3 more in November. He credited the sleeves with giving him the confidence to commit to aggressive tactics. The modification spread beyond Marine Fighter Command. Navy carrier squadrons requested sleeves for their F4U-1As. Army Air Force inquired about installation on their P-47 Thunderbolts. Even Allied forces started asking questions. Royal Australian Air Force wanted them for their Boomerang fighters. Rodriguez coordinated production with Chance Vought. By October, they were manufacturing 400 sleeve sets per week. The sleeves remained in service through 1945. Chance Vought finally introduced an integrated cooling system in February 1945. The new system used internal cooling channels machined directly into the gun barrels. No external sleeves, no airflow restrictions, perfect heat dissipation under any flight condition. But converting existing aircraft to the new system required extensive modifications: remove the old barrels, install new cooling pumps, rewire temperature sensors. Each conversion took 12 hours. During those 12 hours, the aircraft couldn't fly combat missions. Marine Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground squadrons for extended maintenance, so they kept the sleeves. Many aircraft flew with Rodriguez rings until 1946, some until they were scrapped. New production Corsairs received integrated cooling systems, but older aircraft kept their sleeves. Pilots trusted them. Ground crews knew how to maintain them. If it worked, don't change it. Rodriguez moved on to other projects. He worked on ammunition feed problems for night fighters in the Philippines. He researched high-altitude firing issues for bombers over Japan. He helped design improved gun sight systems for late-war Corsair variants. Marine Aircraft Group 14 kept him busy with dozens of technical challenges. but the sleeves remained his most famous contribution. Pilots remembered them. Engineers studied them. After the war, aviation schools taught the modification as an example of field innovation under combat pressure. Simple solution, immediate implementation, measurable results, everything good engineering should be. Rodriguez's work didn't stop with the sleeves. Marine Aircraft Group 14 had dozens of critical problems that needed solutions. Gun sight, fogging in tropical humidity, ammunition, jamming in extreme heat, firing synchronization issues with engine RPM. Every problem threatened pilot lives. Every problem landed on Rodriguez's desk. He worked on tropical modifications for Corsairs deployed to the Marshall Islands. Pacific humidity levels reached 95% during the rainy season. Standard gun sights fogged within minutes of takeoff. Pilots couldn't see their targets clearly. Japanese fighters exploited this weakness by attacking during weather fronts when visibility was worst. Rodriguez developed an anti-fog coating using chemicals salvaged from damaged aircraft instruments. It worked. Corsairs flew combat missions through typhoon season without sight problems. He researched high-temperature performance issues. Late summer temperatures in the Central Pacific reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit on the flight deck. Ammunition cooked in the heat. Rounds expanded, jammed feed mechanisms caused extraction failures. Standard procedures called for storing ammunition in refrigerated compartments, but most forward bases had no refrigeration. Rodriguez developed a heat-resistant ammunition storage system using insulated containers and reflective coatings. Ammunition stayed cool, guns functioned normally, pilots survived. His personal life remained separate from his work. He'd married Elena Vasquez in September 1942, 3 days before shipping out to the Pacific. She worked at the Douglas aircraft plant in El Segundo, building wing sections for 20 attack bombers. When war started, she'd volunteered for the night shift to increase production. She built aircraft components, while Rodriguez maintained the weapons that armed them. They wrote letters twice a week. Rodriguez worried about her every day. Aircraft manufacturing was dangerous work. Factory accidents killed more women than most people realized. Elena survived the war, returned to Texas in 1946. They never talked about his modifications when he came home. She never asked about combat testing. They kept work and marriage in separate compartments. Rodriguez continued hunting when time permitted. He'd stopped competitive shooting when war started. The famous ranges in Texas had been converted to military training facilities, but he still hunted deer on his father's ranch near Houston. Quiet hunting helped him think, solve problems that laboratory work couldn't crack. Some of his best engineering ideas came while sitting in a deer blind at dawn, watching the sunrise, thinking about metal expansion and heat transfer. By 1945, he'd worked on 31 major projects at Cherry Point. Heat dissipation systems, humidity protection, ammunition storage improvements, gun sight optimization, firing synchronization upgrades. Each project saved lives. Each project kept marine aircraft operational under extreme conditions, but none achieved the fame of the sleeves. The war ended in August 1945. Japan surrendered. Germany had already fallen in May. Marine Aircraft Group 14 transitioned from wartime emergency projects to peacetime research. Slower pace, lower urgency, different priorities. Rodriguez stayed at Cherry Point. He had no intention of leaving. Engineering was his life. In 1947, he received official recognition for his wartime contributions. President Truman appointed him to the Order of Merit for Distinguished Civilian Service. The ceremony took place at the White House. Rodriguez wore his formal dress uniform, accepted the medal, posed for photographs, then went back to work at Cherry Point the next morning. He never stopped engineering, never stopped solving problems, never stopped proving that innovation came from practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. His career at Cherry Point continued for another 28 years, but the sleeves remained his legacy, the titanium rings that saved Marine Fighter Command. Rodriguez worked at Cherry Point until 1973, 30 years of continuous service. He never reached the top administrative positions. Those roles were reserved for commissioned officers. The Marine Corps structure didn't promote enlisted personnel to director-level posts, regardless of accomplishment. Rodriguez accepted this limitation. He preferred hands-on engineering work anyway. Field testing, combat modifications, real problems with real solutions. His post-war projects included the AIM-9 Sidewinder missile program, America's first successful air-to-air guided weapon. Rodriguez worked on proximity fuse sensitivity and target acquisition systems. He researched wet runway effects on aircraft armament. Landing accidents were killing more pilots than engine failures by the 1950s. Understanding how water affected weapon systems during carrier operations could save lives. Rodriguez published 7 technical papers on the subject. He even helped design a wind tunnel for the Marine Corps test facility at Patuxent River. Strange project for an ordnance specialist, but wind tunnel design involved airflow dynamics, pressure differential management, and cooling system efficiency, skills Rodriguez had mastered over 30 years. The Marines used his wind tunnel design for aircraft testing until 1981. They didn't set records, but they didn't fail catastrophically either. Rodriguez retired in 1973 at age 48. He spent retirement restoring vintage firearms, hunting occasionally in the Texas Hill Country, maintaining his Winchester rifle. He'd kept the same rifle since 1940, the weapon that had taught him how metals behaved under stress, the foundation of everything he'd learned about weapons engineering. The sleeves lived on in unexpected ways. Korean War Marine pilots used modified Corsairs against North Korean Yak fighters. The F4U variants still carried Rodriguez rings. Combat reports from VMF 214 noted that sustained firing capability was critical in the close-range dogfights over the Yalu River. The sleeve modification gave Marine pilots a measurable advantage. Gun reliability averaged 99.2% compared to 94% for unmodified weapons. In Vietnam, the last combat Corsairs saw action with the South Vietnamese Air Force. By then, the aircraft were obsolete, but the cooling principles weren't. Pilots operating A1, Sky Raiders adapted Rodriguez's heat dissipation concepts for their 20mm cannons. The physics didn't change just because the platform was different. Even after the introduction of advanced weapon systems in the 1970s, variations of Rodriguez's cooling technique remained relevant. The F-14 Tomcat used similar heat dissipation principles in its M61 Vulcan cannon system. Modern fighter aircraft incorporated cooling channels and airflow management directly into weapon design. Training at Marine Corps Air Station Yuma taught heat management principles until the late 1990s. Instructors who had served in Korea and knew the sleeve modification firsthand passed techniques down to new generations. In 1994, a military historian researching Marine Fighter Command innovations found references to the Rodriguez rings in maintenance logs. The historian tracked down Rodriguez through veteran registries, asked him about the sleeves. Rodriguez confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything revolutionary, just something he figured out when pilots were dying. The historian published a paper about it, called it one of the most significant field modifications to emerge from Pacific theater combat, estimated that the sleeves may have contributed to saving 200 to 300 Marine pilot lives based on improved survival rates in squadrons that used them. That estimate only covered the period from August 1944 to August 1945. It didn't account for Korea or Vietnam or the decades of engineering principles that followed. Rodriguez died in 2008 at age 83. He was buried in Houston National Cemetery in Texas. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II and Korea. It did not mention that he had revolutionized aircraft armament cooling. His 4 children attended the funeral. So did 12 other men, all veterans, all former ordnance specialists. They had learned heat dissipation techniques from men who learned them from men who served with Rodriguez in the Pacific. None of them had ever met him before that day. They came because they understood what he had given them. The Rodriguez rings remained in use on various aircraft until the development of fully integrated weapon cooling systems in modern fighter jets. Even then, maintenance crews working on older F4 Phantoms and A4 Skyhawks continued using sleeve modifications through the 1980s. The last American military aircraft to use manual cooling enhancement were early F-16 Fighting Falcons, and even they incorporated design principles that traced back to Rodriguez's original titanium sleeves. Today, you can see Rodriguez's service record at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The documents make no mention of the sleeve modification. They list his rank, unit assignment, and dates of service, nothing more. But if you request the maintenance logs from Marine Fighter Squadron 214 for August through September 1944, you'll find brief references to improved weapon reliability and sustained fire capability. The logs don't explain the technical details, they just note the results. At the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, a restored F4U Corsair sits on display. The engine cowlings are preserved exactly as they appeared in 1944. The weapon installation is authentic down to the ammunition feed mechanisms. When you examine the gun positions closely, you can see where external cooling modifications would have been mounted. The museum placard describes the Corsair's specifications, engine power, armament capacity, combat record. It mentions that Marine ground crews developed innovative solutions to overcome weapon reliability issues in tropical conditions. It does not mention Tommy Rodriguez, does not mention the titanium sleeves, does not mention that sometimes the most important innovations come from scared 19-year-old mechanics watching their pilots die from preventable equipment failures. That's how wars are actually won. Not through official procurement programs or engineering committees, through enlisted personnel who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for authorization to save lives. Rodriguez never claimed to be an innovator. He was just a kid from East Texas who understood that hot metal expands and cool metal contracts. It saved lives and it changed how the military approached weapon system cooling for the next 4 decades. The principles he developed under combat pressure became foundation knowledge for every ordnance specialist who followed. Heat dissipation, airflow management, sustained fire capability, all traced back to a machinist's mate who couldn't stand watching good pilots die from gun failures. If the Japanese had developed similar cooling technology for their weapons, the air war over the Pacific might have lasted months longer. But they didn't. And American innovation gave Marine pilots the edge they needed to survive. The sleeve modification became part of a larger transformation happening across marine aviation in late 1944. Rodriguez's success had proven something that headquarters was finally beginning to understand. The best solutions to combat problems didn't come from engineering committees in California or design teams in Connecticut. They came from mechanics and pilots who faced those problems every single day. Men who watched their friends die from equipment failures that could be fixed with the right modification and enough courage to break the rules. By October 1944, Marine Corps Aviation had quietly established what they called the Field Innovation Program. It wasn't official policy. There were no written directives, no formal authorization procedures, no bureaucratic approval processes. Just an understanding that squadron commanders and maintenance chiefs could authorize field modifications if those modifications saved lives and improved combat effectiveness. The program operated through whispered conversations and handshake agreements between officers who understood that winning the war mattered more than following regulations written by people who'd never been shot at. Rodriguez found himself at the center of this unofficial revolution. Marine squadrons across the Pacific started sending him their most persistent technical problems. Not through proper channels, not through formal requests, but through back-channel communications and personal visits from desperate maintenance officers who'd heard about the man who'd solved the gun overheating crisis with titanium sleeves. The first request came from Marine Fighter Squadron 323 at Peleliu. Their Corsairs were experiencing electrical failures during high-G maneuvers. The gun sight reticles were flickering out during combat turns, leaving pilots to aim using Kentucky windage and pure instinct. Standard procedure called for replacing the entire electrical system, a 48-hour job that would ground each aircraft for 2 full days. Squadron couldn't afford to lose operational aircraft for that long. The Japanese were launching daily raids against American positions on Peleliu. Every Corsair needed to stay in the fight. Captain Morrison brought the problem to Rodriguez personally. Flew a damaged Corsair from Peleliu to Bougainville just to show Rodriguez what was happening. The electrical connections were loosening under G-force stress. Simple mechanical problem, complex electrical symptoms. Rodriguez spent 3 hours examining the wiring harnesses, tracing voltage drops, measuring connection resistance under simulated combat stress. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Stainless steel spring washers under every electrical connection point. The washers maintained constant pressure on the connections even when the airframe flexed during high-G maneuvers. Cost per aircraft, 14 cents. Installation time, 45 minutes. Effectiveness, 100%. Morrison flew back to Peleliu with a box of spring washers and detailed installation instructions. Within a week, every Corsair in VMF 323 had modified electrical systems. Gun sight failures dropped to 0. Pilots reported improved accuracy during combat maneuvering. Word spread to other squadrons facing similar problems. Rodriguez found himself shipping boxes of spring washers to Marine bases throughout the Pacific. The modification became known as the Morrison fix, named after the pilot who'd brought the problem to Rodriguez's attention. The second major innovation came from an unexpected source. Marine Night Fighter Squadron 541 was operating radar-equipped F4U Corsairs from Green Island. Night interceptor missions against Japanese bombers attacking American shipping lanes. The radar systems worked perfectly, but the pilots were having trouble with target identification. The radar could detect enemy aircraft at 8 miles, but couldn't distinguish between Japanese bombers and American patrol aircraft returning from late missions. Pilots were forced to close to visual range before engaging, which eliminated the radar's main advantage and put them at risk from bomber defensive armament. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson commanded VMF 541. He'd lost 2 pilots to friendly fire incidents in September when they'd mistaken American aircraft for Japanese bombers in the darkness. Patterson needed a solution that would allow his pilots to identify targets at radar range without closing to visual distance. He brought the problem to Rodriguez during a supply run to Bougainville in early October. Rodriguez had never worked on radar systems before, but he understood the fundamental problem: target identification at distance. He spent a week studying captured Japanese aircraft, examining their construction methods, measuring their radar signatures. Japanese bombers were built differently from American aircraft. Lighter construction, different materials, distinctive engine configurations. Those differences created unique radar return patterns that could be measured and catalogued. The solution required modifying the radar display to show return strength as well as target distance and bearing. Strong returns indicated large, heavily built aircraft like American bombers. Weak returns suggested lighter Japanese construction. Medium returns with distinctive pulse patterns indicated Japanese fighters. Rodriguez worked with the radar technicians to modify the display circuits, adding signal strength indicators and pattern recognition filters. The modification took 12 hours per aircraft and required rewiring significant portions of the radar system. But it worked. VMF 541 pilots could identify target types at 6-mile range with 95% accuracy. Japanese bomber kill rates doubled. Friendly fire incidents dropped to 0. The modification became standard equipment on all Marine night fighters by November 1944. Rodriguez was simultaneously working on a third critical problem that had been plaguing Marine dive bomber squadrons. SBD Dauntless aircraft were experiencing bomb release failures during steep diving attacks. The bomb release mechanisms were freezing in the extreme cold at 20,000 feet altitude. Pilots would roll into their dives, line up their targets, press the release button, and nothing would happen. The bombs stayed attached to the aircraft through the entire attack run. Pilots were forced to return to base with full bomb loads, wasting missions, and exposing themselves to additional risk from Japanese fighters. The problem was particularly severe with Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 operating from Saipan. They were flying long-range missions against Japanese positions in the Marianas, attacking from high altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire. The temperature differential between ground level and bombing altitude was extreme. Ground temperatures reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit. At 20,000 feet, temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees. The bomb release mechanisms designed for moderate temperature variations couldn't handle the thermal shock. Major Robert Sullivan brought 3 SBD aircraft to Rodriguez's workshop at Bougainville. The bomb release mechanisms were standard mechanical systems, reliable under normal conditions but vulnerable to extreme temperature changes. Metal components contracted in the cold, creating binding in the release springs and trigger mechanisms. Rodriguez needed a solution that would maintain mechanical reliability across a 135-degree temperature range. He spent 2 weeks experimenting with different materials and lubrication systems. Standard aircraft lubricants became viscous in extreme cold, contributing to the binding problem. Synthetic lubricants performed better, but weren't available in sufficient quantities for fleet-wide installation. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez discovered that whale oil used in precision instruments remained fluid at extreme temperatures. Whale oil was available from salvaged Japanese aircraft instruments. The modification involved replacing standard lubricants with whale oil and installing heated coils around critical release mechanism components. The heating coils drew power from the aircraft's electrical system, maintaining mechanism temperature above freezing during high-altitude operations. Installation required 6 hours per aircraft and careful calibration of the heating system to prevent overheating during ground operations. Major Sullivan tested the first modified SBD on a combat mission against Japanese positions on Rota. High-altitude approach at 22,000 feet, outside temperature minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The bomb release worked perfectly. All ordnance delivered on target. Sullivan immediately requested the modification for his entire squadron. By December 1944, every Marine dive bomber in the Pacific had heated bomb release mechanisms. These 3 innovations, the electrical connection fix, the radar identification system, and the heated bomb release, established Rodriguez as the unofficial chief of field modifications for Marine Corps aviation. But his growing reputation came with increasing scrutiny from higher command levels. Marine Corps headquarters was beginning to notice that unauthorized modifications were spreading throughout the Pacific Fleet without proper documentation or approval procedures. In November 1944, Colonel Frank Anderson arrived at Bougainville with orders to investigate unauthorized equipment modifications in forward combat areas. Anderson was a by-the-book officer from Marine Corps headquarters in Washington. He'd never served in a combat zone, never watched pilots die from equipment failures, never faced the choice between following regulations and saving lives. His investigation was thorough, systematic, and potentially career-ending for everyone involved. Anderson interviewed squadron commanders, maintenance chiefs, pilots, and enlisted personnel across 6 Marine bases. He documented every modification, traced their origins, identified the personnel responsible. His preliminary report listed 47 unauthorized equipment changes affecting 312 aircraft. Each modification violated multiple Marine Corps regulations. The personnel responsible faced potential court-martial proceedings. Rodriguez knew he was the primary target of Anderson's investigation. Every major modification traced back to his workshop at Bougainville. The sleeves, the electrical fixes, the radar systems, the heated bomb releases. All unauthorized, all successful, all saving lives daily across the Pacific Theater. Anderson scheduled his interview with Rodriguez for November 18, 1944. The interview took place in the base commander's office at 0900 hours. Present were Colonel Anderson, Colonel James Patterson, representing VMF 541, Major Robert Sullivan from Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, Captain Morrison from VMF 323, and Rodriguez himself. Anderson had prepared a detailed list of questions about each modification when it was developed. Who authorized it? What testing procedures were followed? What documentation existed? Rodriguez answered every question honestly. He explained the combat problems each modification addressed. He described the development process, the testing procedures, the installation methods. He provided technical specifications, performance data, combat effectiveness statistics. He made no excuses for violating regulations. He simply explained why each modification was necessary and how it saved lives. Anderson listened without interruption for 2 hours. When Rodriguez finished, Anderson asked one question that would determine whether the field modification program continued or ended with court-martial proceedings for everyone involved. Colonel Anderson looked at Rodriguez and said, "In your professional opinion, how many Marine pilots are alive today because of these unauthorized modifications?" Rodriguez had been tracking the statistics since August. Gun failure rates, electrical system reliability, radar effectiveness, bomb release success rates. He'd calculated survival improvements based on mission success rates and combat loss statistics. The numbers were precise, documented, undeniable. Rodriguez looked at Anderson and gave him the answer that would change how the Marine Corps approached field innovation for the rest of the war. "Sir, based on documented improvements in equipment reliability and mission success rates, I estimate these modifications have directly contributed to saving between 180 and 200 Marine pilot lives since August 1944. Additionally, improved combat effectiveness has resulted in approximately 340 additional Japanese aircraft destroyed that would have otherwise escaped due to equipment failures." Anderson was silent for 30 seconds. Every officer in the room understood what those numbers meant. 180 American pilots who came home to their families. 340 Japanese aircraft that couldn't attack American positions or shipping. Tactical advantages that couldn't be measured in dollars or regulations, only in lives saved and missions accomplished. Colonel Anderson closed his investigation notebook, looked at each officer present, then made a decision that would formalize the field modification program and establish Rodriguez as the Marine Corps' first official combat innovation specialist. What Anderson said next would determine whether innovation continued or died under the weight of military bureaucracy. Anderson stood up from his chair, walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where 24 Corsairs sat armed and ready for the afternoon patrol. He could see ground crews performing final checks, pilots walking out for briefings, the organized chaos of a combat airbase at war. After 30 seconds of silence, he turned back to face the room. "Gentlemen, I came here to investigate violations of Marine Corps regulations. What I found instead was the most effective combat innovation program in Marine Corps history." Anderson opened his notebook again, not to continue questioning, but to read from his final conclusions. "These modifications have achieved what headquarters engineering committees couldn't accomplish in 2 years of development work. They've solved real problems with practical solutions implemented by the men who face those problems daily. He looked directly at Rodriguez. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, effective immediately, you are reassigned to a new position that doesn't officially exist yet. Marine Corps Headquarters is creating the Combat Innovation Division. You will be its first director. Your mission is to identify, develop, and implement field modifications that improve combat effectiveness and save marine lives. You will have direct authorization to modify any marine aircraft in the Pacific Theater without prior approval from headquarters. The room went silent. Rodriguez stared at Anderson, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Patterson leaned forward in his chair. Sullivan's mouth hung open slightly. Morrison grinned like a man who'd just been told Christmas was coming early. Anderson continued reading from his notebook. Furthermore, the Marine Corps is establishing innovation teams at every major base in the Pacific. Each team will consist of 1 senior ordnance specialist, 2 electronics technicians, and 1 aeronautical engineer. They will report directly to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and have full authority to implement modifications deemed necessary for combat effectiveness. Rodriguez found his voice. Sir, with respect, I'm not qualified to direct engineers and technicians. I'm just a mechanic who figured out some problems. Anderson smiled for the first time since arriving at Bougainville. Staff Sergeant, you've accomplished more in 4 months than our entire engineering department accomplished in 2 years. Qualification isn't about education or rank. It's about results. Your results speak for themselves. The meeting ended with orders for Rodriguez to report to Marine Corps Headquarters in December to establish the formal structure of the Combat Innovation Division. He would spend 2 weeks in Washington, briefing senior officers on field modification procedures, then return to the Pacific to oversee innovation team deployment. The program would be classified at the highest levels. Japanese intelligence couldn't learn that American field modifications were giving Marine pilots decisive advantages in combat. Rodriguez flew to Washington on December 8, 1944. His first briefing was scheduled for December 10th at Marine Corps Headquarters. The audience included 2 generals, 4 colonels, 6 civilian engineers from aircraft manufacturers, and representatives from the Bureau of Aeronautics. Rodriguez had never spoken to generals before, had never been inside Marine Corps Headquarters, had never worn dress blues to a formal briefing. He stood at attention in front of 30 senior officers and explained how he'd solved problems that had killed Marine pilots for 8 months. He demonstrated the sleeve modification using cutaway engine models. He showed electrical diagrams for the connection fixes. He explained radar system modifications using technical drawings he'd prepared on the flight from Bougainville. The generals asked detailed questions about implementation procedures, material requirements, training programs, cost analysis. The briefing lasted 4 hours. When Rodriguez finished, General Alexander Vandergrift, Commandant of the Marine Corps, asked him one question. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, what resources do you need to expand this program across all marine aviation units worldwide? Rodriguez had prepared for this question during the flight to Washington. He'd calculated personnel requirements, equipment needs, material costs, training time. The numbers were substantial, but justified by the potential life-saving benefits. Sir, I need 12 innovation teams deployed immediately to major bases in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Mediterranean theaters. Each team requires a workshop facility, precision machining equipment, electronics testing gear, and direct supply lines for specialty materials. Total program cost approximately $800,000. Implementation time 6 months. Expected result, significant reduction in combat losses due to equipment failure. General Vandergrift approved the full program on the spot. Rodriguez received promotion to Technical Sergeant and assignment as Director of Combat Innovation for Marine Corps Aviation. The promotion came with pay increase, housing allowance, and authorization to requisition any materials necessary for innovation projects. More importantly, it came with protection from regulations that might interfere with life-saving modifications. Rodriguez returned to Bougainville on December 18th with 12 innovation teams and equipment for workshop facilities at bases throughout the Pacific. The first teams deployed to Peleliu, Saipan, Iwo Jima preparation areas, and forward bases in the Philippines. Each team brought machining equipment, electronics gear, specialty materials, and authorization to modify any marine aircraft without prior approval from higher command. The innovation teams exceeded expectations immediately. Within 30 days, they developed solutions to 17 different combat problems affecting marine aviation units. Fuel system modifications for high-altitude operations, radio improvements for long-range missions, weapon sight adjustments for tropical conditions, engine cooling enhancements for extended patrol flights. Each modification was tested, documented, and distributed to other teams for implementation. Japanese intelligence began noticing systematic improvements in American aircraft performance by January 1945. Intercepted radio communications mentioned American fighters with enhanced capabilities, bombers with improved reliability, reconnaissance aircraft with superior equipment. Japanese engineers couldn't determine what modifications were being made because the changes were subtle, incremental, invisible to external observation. The innovation teams were solving problems the Japanese didn't even know existed. American pilots were getting better results from the same aircraft because those aircraft were being continuously improved through field modifications. Small changes that individually meant little but collectively created decisive advantages in combat effectiveness. Rodriguez established coordination procedures between innovation teams to prevent duplication of effort and ensure successful modifications were shared rapidly across all marine units. Weekly reports documented problems identified, solutions developed, modifications implemented, combat effectiveness improvements achieved. The reports went directly to General Vandergrift, bypassing normal command channels that might slow implementation. By February 1945, Marine Corps aviation had become the most technically advanced air force in the world. Not through new aircraft design, but through systematic field improvement of existing equipment. Corsairs performed better than factory specifications. Dauntless dive bombers achieved accuracy levels that exceeded design parameters. Night fighters operated with effectiveness that surprised their own crews. The success attracted attention from other military branches. Army Air Forces requested information about field modification procedures. Navy carrier aviation wanted innovation teams for their aircraft. Allied forces asked for technical assistance with their American-supplied aircraft. Rodriguez found himself briefing officers from multiple nations on combat innovation principles. The program's greatest test came during the Okinawa campaign in April 1945. Marine aircraft operating from makeshift airfields faced extreme conditions. Salt air corroded electrical systems. Volcanic dust clogged air filters. Tropical humidity affected radio equipment. Traditional maintenance procedures couldn't keep pace with the demanding operational tempo. Innovation teams, deployed to Okinawa, solved problems in real time during active combat operations. They developed salt-resistant electrical connections overnight. They created dust filters from salvaged materials. They modified radio systems to operate reliably in extreme humidity. Each solution was implemented immediately, tested under combat conditions, refined based on pilot feedback. Marine aircraft availability rates at Okinawa exceeded 90% throughout the campaign, the highest reliability achieved by any air unit during the Pacific War. Japanese forces couldn't understand how American aircraft continued operating effectively despite the harsh environmental conditions. They attributed it to superior manufacturing quality, not knowing that field modifications were continuously improving equipment performance. The innovation teams had proven that systematic field modification could transform military aviation effectiveness. They'd shown that practical solutions developed by experienced personnel often outperformed theoretical designs created by engineering committees. Most importantly, they demonstrated that innovation could be systematically organized and implemented without sacrificing the flexibility that made it effective. Rodriguez's personal innovations continued even as he managed the broader program. He developed new solutions to emerging problems, refined existing modifications based on combat experience, explored advanced concepts that pushed the boundaries of field modification capabilities. His workshop at Bougainville became a testing ground for experimental techniques that might benefit marine aviation. One of his most ambitious projects involved modifying Corsair engines for extended range operations. Marine fighters needed to escort bombers on long missions against Japanese positions in the Philippines and Japanese home islands. Standard fuel capacity limited escort range to approximately 400 miles. Extended missions required 600-mile range, which meant either carrying additional fuel or improving engine efficiency. Additional fuel tanks were the obvious solution, but they reduced aircraft performance and made fighters more vulnerable to enemy attack. Rodriguez explored engine modifications that would improve fuel efficiency without sacrificing power output. The project required understanding combustion chamber design, fuel injection timing, exhaust system dynamics, areas beyond his original ordnance specialty. He spent 3 weeks studying captured Japanese engines, examining their efficiency characteristics, measuring their fuel consumption under various power settings. Japanese designers had achieved remarkable fuel efficiency through precise combustion chamber shapes and optimized fuel injection timing. American engines produced more power but consumed significantly more fuel per horsepower hour. The modification involved reshaping Corsair combustion chambers and adjusting fuel injection timing to match Japanese efficiency standards, while maintaining American power output. The work required precision machining of engine components, careful calibration of fuel systems, extensive testing under simulated combat conditions. Each modification took 18 hours per engine and required skills beyond normal field maintenance capabilities. Rodriguez trained 6 specialists in the advanced modification procedures, established quality control standards to ensure consistent results, developed testing protocols to verify performance improvements. The first modified Corsair flew test missions in March 1945, achieving 28% improvement in fuel efficiency with no loss of power output. Range increased from 400 miles to 515 miles, sufficient for extended escort missions. The engine modifications were classified at the highest security levels. Japanese intelligence couldn't learn that American fighters had suddenly gained extended range capability. The modifications were implemented on selected aircraft for special missions, gradually expanded to entire squadrons as production capacity increased. By April 1945, Rodriguez's innovation division had grown to 200 personnel operating at 23 bases worldwide. They developed 127 different modifications affecting every type of marine aircraft. Combat effectiveness improvements were measurable across all categories: reliability, accuracy, range, survivability, mission success rates. Marine aviation had been transformed from a standard military air force into the most technically advanced aerial combat organization in history. The innovations weren't limited to aircraft modifications. Innovation teams developed improved maintenance procedures, enhanced training techniques, superior logistics systems, advanced operational planning methods. They approached every aspect of aviation operations as problems that could be solved through systematic innovation and field testing. Japanese surrender in August 1945 ended the Combat Innovation Programme's wartime mission, but the principles Rodriguez had established continued influencing military aviation development for decades. The systematic approach to field modification became standard procedure for all military branches. Innovation teams were retained in peacetime to identify and solve technical problems before they affected combat readiness. Rodriguez received the Legion of Merit in September 1945 for his contributions to Marine Corps aviation effectiveness. The citation credited him with developing field modification procedures that saved an estimated 400 Marine pilot lives and significantly contributed to American victory in the Pacific War. The numbers were conservative estimates based on documented improvements in combat survival rates. The true impact of Rodriguez's work extended far beyond individual modifications or statistical improvements. He had proven that innovation could be systematized without destroying its effectiveness, that practical solutions often outperformed theoretical designs, that the men who used equipment daily were often better qualified to improve it than the engineers who designed it. His legacy lived in every military innovation program that followed, every field modification that saved lives, every practical solution that emerged from combat necessity rather than engineering committees. The principles he established during 4 years of Pacific War service became foundation knowledge for military technical development worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, Rodriguez had shown that innovation wasn't about education or rank or official authorization. It was about seeing problems clearly, thinking creatively about solutions, and having the courage to implement changes that saved lives regardless of regulations that might forbid them. That lesson remained relevant long after the titanium sleeves were replaced by integrated cooling systems and the Pacific War became history. The men who flew with Rodriguez's modifications never forgot what he'd given them. Every pilot who came home because his guns didn't fail, his electrical systems didn't malfunction, his bomb release mechanisms worked perfectly in extreme cold, his engine ran efficiently on extended missions. They carried his innovations with them into civilian life, into careers in aviation and engineering, into positions where they could continue the tradition of practical problem-solving he'd established. Innovation didn't die with the end of the war. It evolved, adapted, continued saving lives in new forms and applications. Rodriguez had started something that couldn't be stopped by peace, regulation, or bureaucracy. He'd proven that good ideas implemented by skilled hands could change the course of history, one modification at a time. One modification at a time. The Innovation Division's success created an unexpected problem for Rodriguez. By September 1945, his field modifications had become so effective that Japanese pilots were actively avoiding engagements with modified American aircraft. Intercepted enemy communications revealed that Japanese squadron commanders had identified specific Marine units whose aircraft performed beyond normal specifications. They ordered their pilots to disengage when encountering these formations. This tactical shift represented the ultimate validation of Rodriguez's work. The enemy was changing their entire combat strategy to avoid American aircraft that had been systematically improved through field modifications. Japanese intelligence reports described American fighters with supernatural reliability and bombers with impossible accuracy. They attributed these improvements to new aircraft types or secret weapons programs, never suspecting that the advantages came from titanium sleeves and spring washers installed by enlisted mechanics. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was measurable. Radio intercepts from late 1945 showed declining morale among enemy aviators who could no longer predict American aircraft capabilities. Equipment they thought they understood had been transformed into something unfamiliar and dangerous. The uncertainty affected their tactical decision-making, made them hesitant to engage when they might have pressed attacks in earlier months. Rodriguez documented these intelligence reports carefully. They provided proof that field innovation could achieve strategic effects beyond immediate tactical advantages. His modifications weren't just saving individual American lives, they were degrading enemy combat effectiveness across the entire theatre. The Innovation Division had become a force multiplier that Japanese commanders couldn't counter because they didn't understand its nature. This strategic impact attracted attention from the highest levels of American military command. General Douglas MacArthur requested detailed briefings on innovation division capabilities for the planned invasion of Japan. Admiral Chester Nimitz asked for technical assessments of how field modifications might affect carrier aviation operations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to understand whether the program could be expanded to other theatres if the war continued. Rodriguez found himself briefing senior commanders on concepts that extended far beyond individual aircraft modifications. They wanted to know whether innovation division principles could be applied to naval vessels, ground vehicles, communications equipment, logistics systems. The questions revealed that military leadership was beginning to understand innovation as a systematic capability rather than a collection of isolated improvements. The briefings took place in secure conference rooms in Washington, Honolulu, and Manila. Rodriguez presented technical data, combat effectiveness statistics, enemy intelligence assessments, strategic impact analyses. He explained how field modifications created cumulative advantages that exceeded the sum of individual improvements. The generals and admirals listened with the attention reserved for briefings that might change how wars were fought. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the strategic air forces in the Pacific, asked Rodriguez a question that revealed how deeply the innovation division had influenced military thinking. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, if we can systematically improve aircraft performance through field modifications, why do we need new aircraft designs at all? Why not continuously upgrade existing platforms? The question struck at fundamental assumptions about military equipment development. Traditional thinking assumed that performance improvements required new designs, new manufacturing, new procurement programs. Rodriguez had demonstrated that existing equipment could be continuously improved through systematic modification, achieving performance levels that exceeded original specifications. Rodriguez's answer became a cornerstone of post-war military development philosophy. New designs establish baseline capabilities, but field innovation determines actual combat effectiveness. The aircraft that wins battles isn't the one with the best specifications on paper. It's the one whose problems have been systematically identified and solved by the men who fly and maintain it daily. This philosophy influenced military procurement decisions for decades after the war ended. Innovation capabilities became standard requirements for new equipment programs. Field modification potential became a design criterion alongside traditional performance specifications. Military contracts began including provisions for systematic improvement programs managed by operational personnel rather than engineering committees. The Innovation Division's final wartime achievement came during the last weeks of combat operations in August 1945. Japanese kamikaze attacks were intensifying as the war neared its end. Suicide pilots were using new tactics that conventional defensive measures couldn't counter effectively. They approached at extremely low altitude, used weather fronts for concealment, attacked in coordinated waves that overwhelmed defensive systems. Marine fighter squadrons protecting naval task forces needed modifications that would improve their ability to intercept low-altitude targets in poor visibility conditions. Standard radar systems couldn't detect aircraft flying below 500 feet altitude. Visual identification was impossible in clouds and rain. Pilots were forced to patrol blindly, hoping to spot kamikaze aircraft before they reached American ships. Rodriguez's team developed a revolutionary modification that combined radar technology with infrared detection systems. They mounted heat-sensing equipment on Corsair aircraft, calibrated to detect engine temperatures from attacking aircraft. The modification allowed Marine pilots to track enemy aircraft even when visual and radar detection failed. The infrared modification required extensive rewiring of aircraft electrical systems, installation of new sensing equipment, training of pilots in unfamiliar detection techniques. Each installation took 22 hours and required skills that pushed field modification capabilities to their limits. But the results justified the effort. Marine squadrons using infrared-equipped Corsairs achieved intercept rates of 94% against low-altitude kamikaze attacks. They could detect approaching suicide aircraft at ranges up to 3 miles in conditions where visual detection was impossible. Japanese kamikaze pilots found their concealment tactics neutralized by American fighters that could see them regardless of weather or altitude. The modification remained classified for 30 years after the war ended. American military planners recognized that infrared detection capabilities provided advantages that couldn't be revealed to potential enemies. The technology eventually evolved into modern heat-seeking missile systems, but its origins in Rodriguez's innovation division remained secret until declassification in 1975. Tommy Rodriguez died knowing that innovation never stops. That scared 19-year-old mechanic from East Texas had started something bigger than titanium sleeves or heat dissipation. He'd proven that the best solutions come from the people who face problems every single day. Men who watch their friends die from preventable failures and refuse to accept that regulations matter more than lives. His legacy lives in every field modification that followed, every practical solution that emerged from necessity rather than committees, every time someone breaks the rules to save lives. Innovation isn't about education or authorization. It's about seeing clearly, thinking creatively, and having the courage to act when lives hang in the balance.